Hi, this is Kathy with City Farmhouse Studio. When I first started knitting, one of the first things that confused me was what is a gauge swatch and what is the purpose of it? How do you make it? What is it for? And the main thing is that it tells you how many stitches and how many rows are in an inch for the yarn, the stitches, and the needles that you're using. By finding that out, you'll be sure that whatever you're making, whether it's a sweater or a pillow or a bag, it will be the size that you want it to be at in the end. You won't make a sweater and find out that even a child can't fit into it, or that it will be so large that two of you could fit into it. It will always be the right fit. So how to make a gauge swatch? You first start off by taking that number in your pattern that says 4 inches by 4 inches equals so many stitches by so many rows. And you're going to take the stitches, times it by 1.5, and that should get you a good approximate number to give you a good width where you can measure 4 inches. Now after you cast on, you will want to make sure you knit in what pattern, a stitch structure that the gauge is set for. The pattern should have a note up there by the gauge of what it is that they have measured. Because stockinette to garter stitch to seed stitch, they all have a slight different gauge, even using the same needles. So you really want to make sure you're measuring the right thing. Now to measure, you take a ruler, and some even just have a little strip cut out for your 4 inches so you know exactly where you need to measure from. But you're going to line it up at the edge of one stitch, go over to the 4, and then you count over how many of those stitches lie between. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 21. So I have 21 stitches for my row gauge. And then for rows, you do the same thing but going up and down. And this is a little bit harder for me with my eyes. Things start getting a blur, so I usually have to take a pen to really keep track. I line it to the bottom of kind of that heart shape so I know which, and make sure it's on one column of stitches, and then count by 2. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. So I got 27, almost 28. And whenever I do that, I usually kind of just reset my sample swatch and will recount just to make sure I'm getting consistent too. And that one I got 28. So I'm going to go ahead and say my gauge swatch for this is 22 by 28 rows. Now whenever you go up a needle size, the stitch structure comes open a little bit more. So you can see that changing your needles will change your stitch structure, how that fabric feels, but then also your gauge as well. Not only will changing needles change your gauge, but changing yarn. Now this fabric on the skein, it had a same category as this yarn. This one is a cotton blend. This is a wool blend, different fiber combinations. And you can see that they really look a little different fabric. You can see that they really have a different fabric feel. If you follow them in person, this one feels like cotton and this one feels like wool, but even just visually, the stitch structure and how it shapes looks different. Again, we got 19 by 24 on this sample 20 by 26. So quite a difference, a smaller gauge for this, very much similar, kind of in between the smaller needle to the larger sample, so 22 by 28, 20 by 26, 19 by 24. So why this is so important is so that you can see the structures change and see how your stitches per inch change as well. Because if you went ahead and switched to this different yarn or used your gauge, how you're making in a needle, to what I make in a needle may be different. So if the gauge for a sweater is being called for this gauge, and I went ahead and changed yarn, or I didn't sample my gauge, and maybe my knit structure, how I knit on a certain, with the same yarn, same needles as you is different, maybe I would get something more closer to this gauge, and I go ahead and make a sweater. Let's say I'm making a size large in this gauge swatch that the pattern is called for. In a size large, it's a 42-inch diameter by 23-inch large. With this gauge swatch, I would have then finished a sweater that is only 40 inches in diameter and only 20 3/4 inch long. So a much smaller sweater. And if I needed a 42-inch to fit my bust kind of on a nice fit, that 40 inches may make my sweater a bit too tight for my preference. And then that 20-inch over 2 inches shorter, I may not be comfortable wearing it, as you bend over it pulling up in the back, or it may not be covering what you want to be covering. The sleeves would be too short, the neckline might be too high, the underarms may come up too much and the arms be too tight. Needing one more stitch in this gauge made almost 2 inches different in the diameter. So it really is important that you check your gauge. Another thing that you're going to want to do is take down the measurement of your gauge swatch, but then block it. Wash it, lay it flat, put it in the dryer. However you're going to treat your finished item, treat your gauge swatch, and then remeasure it, because it may change. It may stretch depending on the fiber content and how you block it. It may shrink. Knitting, they tend to lay flat a little bit and the stitches relax, and sometimes you get some growth. Other times you don't. It will all take it into consideration into your final garment measurement. So we've talked about the yarn choice, the different needle sizes can all give you a different gauge in your gauge measurement. Not only do the needle sizes, but needle material will as well. So here I have some aluminum, I have plastic, and then I have some bamboo ones as well. The bamboo, I've really noticed a change in my gauge if I change yarn. Some yarns really slide and slip, so you may need the bamboo, where like wool and bamboo kind of really grip together. So depending on what you need for your gauge, you may find different impacts. I've noticed the different tips, how tight you got to work into your stitches. All of that can be impacted by your needle choice. Also, working with straights, DPNs, circulars, anything that changes your tension, how you're holding the yarn, how tight you're making those stitches on your needles. This could even include what movie you're watching. If you're knitting in bed, if you're knitting in the car, it all can change your tension. If you've had a bad day, if you've had a glass of wine, it all can change your tension, which can change your gauge. So that's where knowing your working gauge, that unblocked measurement, and so that you can refer back to that as you're making a project and not get to a finished point, block everything and find out that your gauge changed whenever you're making your sleeves, and now your sleeves are way wonky, but everything else is fine. Another option that you could do is add a few more rows or take some rows out, especially on a sweater, underneath to shorten or lengthen the body. You can also add rows at the sleeve cuff or up at the shoulder to make your sleeve a little bit longer. Take them out to make things shorter. But whenever you get shaping, like underneath the arm or around a neckline, when you start taking out rows or even stitches to make things narrower, you're going to affect everything overall. So just make sure everything balances out. Another thing you can do is completely change the math for what the pattern has called and create the pattern into the math of your gauge. That does take a lot of work, and it's a whole nother video besides this, but it is an option. I do know some people that for a sweater, they'll make the width, how many stitches, meet the one size that their gauge fits, and then follow along a different size, whether their gauge makes things smaller or larger than what the pattern gauge calls for. But again, whenever you get into shaping, how many rows to stitches, things increase and decrease. It could get a little bit tricky. So I hope with all this information, you now know a little bit more about gauge swatches and why they are so important. If anything, just taking that little bit of extra time to create a little swatch will save you a whole lot of headache in the long run, so that you know all the time you put into whatever you're making, it is going to come out exactly how you want it to. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss out on any other tutorials from City Farmhouse Studio. Bye.